the founders of modern scientific economics, if you want to put it that way, David Ricardo and his group, really had a monetary explanation of the business cycle. But if you look at histories of economic thought, you never find this. It just disappears. It's been plunked down the memory hole. What happens is, everybody says, yeah, Ricardo had and David Hume before him, had a theory of international trade. The theory of international trade essentially goes something like this. International trade and the price level. This is the so-called gold specie flow mechanism. Let's say here you have a bunch of countries, England, France, Germany, whatever. England inflates the money supply. The banks inflate the money supply. The money supply goes up in England. Prices go up because of the direct relationship between money and the price level, prices in general. So prices are dragged up along with it. As English prices go up, certain things happen. Now we find, for one thing, English prices are now no longer competitive with French and German prices. They're competing for world markets. English prices are too high. So this means that the French cut down their imports from England. So English exports decline. And while this is going on, the English prices are too high. Englishmen, now fueled with more money, they think they have more money from the banks, and also looking around and finding out that other prices are cheaper, buy more from France and Germany and the United States and whatever. So imports go up. So the direct result of this inflationary situation in England, of money supply going up, bank money going up, and then prices going up, is that we have exports falling, imports going up, so-called deficit in the balance of payments. How are you going to pay for the deficit? Well, there's only one way to pay for the deficit. In those good old days, there's no such thing as gold exchange standard and all monkeying around with foreign currency reserves. You pay for it with gold. And because the French and the Germans are not going to take anything except gold. They're not interested in sitting on a hoard of pounds. It's only now in a more sophisticated age when these tomfool Germans, Japanese, etc., are sitting on $80 billion worth of dollars, which they can't do anything with. In those days, they were more hard-headed. So they insist on gold, so they have to ship gold out. Well, you keep shipping gold out, you're into a sort of a crisis, particularly if you have a banking system which you're paying in gold. In other words, or silver. Let's say gold, make it simpler. The main situation in the 19th century anyway. You have to pay in gold. You're issuing banknotes or bank deposits. You have to pay in gold. As you keep multiplying banknotes, here's this kind of situation. Here's the bank. The banks are, let's say, 10 to 1 or 5 to 1, whatever the ratio is, of notes and deposits on top of gold. They're expanding their notes and deposits, so they're increasing the top part of the pyramid. And as a result of that, they're losing gold, so the bottom part keeps dropping. So they're getting more and more top-heavy. And as they get more and more top-heavy, they get more and more scared. They're getting a situation with an increasing demand by the French and the Germans, etc., for redemption in gold. In the meantime, the Englishmen start getting a little nervous, because here you are, you're a bank depositor, you're a banknote holder. You look at the balance sheet and you find out the supply of gold is getting less and less proportionately to those deposits. You start cashing in. Why should I wait until the crisis? Let's start cashing in now. This is the great concept of the bank run, by the way. A noble bank run. where you begin to realize down deep in your heart that the bank is really bankrupt. They haven't got the money that they say they've got, and you really sort of thought they have, but you really knew down deep they don't have it. So you start, I'm going to be the first, I'm not going to wait. We'll cash in, and your friends do it, and your relatives do it, and pretty soon the panic is on. So all these things are pressuring in on the English banks, let's say. And finally the crisis occurs. English banks are forced to contract that credit. They have to stop it. There's bank runs, there's guys calling in from abroad and internally. And then you get the contraction of the money supply. And as the money supply contracts, you have bankruptcies and panics, and you have calling in loans, and everybody's in very bad shape for a while. It's a crisis. And then prices fall as a result of the fall of money supply. As the prices fall, we're going to have a reversal of the deficit of the balance of payments. We're going to have a situation as English goods are getting cheaper now, English exports go up, and English imports go down. Imports from England. Now there's not as much incentive to buy from abroad, and anyway, people haven't got the money to buy from abroad that they did before. So now there's a surplus in the balance of payment. The money flows back in, and we have a double regulatory mechanism here, so to speak. We have, on the one hand, a self-regulatory feedback, so to speak, in a balance of payments, limiting the deficits. You can't have now we have like a permanent deficit. We have a deficit at least for 23 years. We'll continue to have it. In those days, what you have in the gold standard mechanism, you have this limiting situation. You have a limit on inflation, and you have a limit on deficit and balance of payments. You have this regulatory kind of device. It's also a device that keeps price levels more or less proportionally throughout the world trading area. So no one country gets out of line with other countries' prices. It's a beautiful system. However, it works less well the more banking inflation you have to muck things up, and the more the regulatory mechanism gets slowed down by government action. So anyway, this is every textbook talks about this Ricardian, Hume-Ricardo species flow mechanism. What they don't talk about is that at the same time that Hume and Ricardo Adam-break theory of species flow price level, they also have a theory of business cycle. It's a fairly simple theory, but it's a pretty damn good one. The theory is the banks inflate money and credit, prices go up, you have a boom, everybody's feeling good, they spend more, etc., and then finally the banks have to contract credit, then you have prices collapsing, etc. This is a one-stage, two-phase business cycle, so to speak, one unit, two-phase business cycle. Well, you might ask, of course, one of the questions is, okay, let's say this explains one unit. Why does it keep on going like this? It's not strictly periodic, but, it's sort of a regular kind of pattern. And the reason is, this is again part of the theory, banks always want to inflate. They always want to expand money and credit. They haven't been able to get away with it here because everything is sort of zeroed in on them. What happens is after a couple of years of shaking out, everybody's sort of forgotten about this, the banks are back in a sound liquid condition, then they can start the process up again, and the whole thing begins once more. And this, of course, added to this is the tendency of the government to inflate, for reasons I think mentioned before. Government always wants to have more money, either to pay for its own expenses or to subsidize favored groups. And the best way to get it is to have the banks inflate the money supply. So this is the Ricardian model. This is the first big monetary theory of the business cycle, emphasizing money in the banks as the major cause. Obviously, I can't prove any of this in these lectures here. I have to refer you to my other writings I recommended. But the point is, this is sort of the basic model. Interestingly enough, in the early 19th century, the United States, everybody thinks of American economic thought as being very backward compared to English. In the United States, they had one shrewd realization. I think Professor McGoldrick was mentioning that notes and deposits are really the same. The English economists, even though they're much more intelligent, much more high-type than the American economists, never really realized until it was too late that banknotes and demand deposits, checking accounts, are the same thing. Economically, they're both part of the money supply. They concentrated on the banknotes and they said, no, demand deposits are something else, they're legitimate, they're not part of the money supply. And they got the whole thing fouled up as a result. And when the Ricardians, who were called the Currency School, and it passed the Noble Appeals Act of 1844, designed to smash the business cycle once and for all by requiring 100% deposit, 100% gold back to any future inflation of banknotes. In other words, if you allow this 10-to-1 to keep on for purposes of, so to ease the transition period, but you say any further increase in notes and deposits, has to be backed by the same amount of gold. To impose a non-inflationary forevermore on the English banking system, they left out the deposits because they didn't think deposits were part of the money supply. And what happens then is the banks start another inflation based purely on its checking accounts, and this discredits the whole currency school because everybody says, you see, so the banks will be business cycle will be stopped by the Appeals Act, and it didn't work. So the whole currency school was discredited forevermore. Let's suppose there's only one bank in the country, even one bank in the entire world. Let's eliminate all deficits and balance of payments. There's now one world government, let's say. Let's assume that there's one world bank, the bank of the world. Okay. There's a compulsory monopoly of the banking system, no competition. We have the bank of the world. Okay, the bank of the world, then, supposing there's a reserve requirement. Well, it doesn't have to be. Supposing there's no reserve requirement. How does the money get created? Well, it gets created very simply. Supposing there's gold for some reason, still an anachronism. Say 1 billion in the asset column. And this might be, let's say you start with 100% reserves to make it very simple. And here you have demand deposits and notes. Let's say demand deposits from that. Let's assume here another model. Everybody, the way they got the gold is by everybody deposited $1 billion worth of gold. Everybody gets a checking account matching it. So you have 1 billion on one side, 1 billion on the other. This is essentially the original Bank of Hamburg and Bank of Amsterdam were 100% gold banks. It's just like warehouses. You deposit the gold, you get a warehouse receipt, and you have 10 ounces of gold there. You can pick it up anytime you want. And you trade the 10-ounce warehouse receipts back and forth. So let's say on top of it, this is non-inflationary. Instead of having $1 billion of gold in your pocket, you now have $1 billion of gold in the bank, and you have a checking account of $1 billion to represent it. There's been no increase in the money supply, it's still $1 billion. Now the Bank of the World starts going on its true purpose, which is to inflate the fairly till kingdom come. What it does is it lends $5 billion to General Dynamics for good and useful purposes. Okay? And what it does is, how does it get the $5 billion? It gets it by creating it out of thin air. This is the fundamental law of banking economics, again agreed upon by all schools of thought in economics, is the banks do not simply borrow your money and re-lend it, they create it. They create it by simply writing out an account saying, okay, you now have a demand deposit of $5 billion, and General Dynamics takes the $5 billion and spends it on new factories and so on, hiring workers, etc., etc. And offsetting this now is an IOU from General Dynamics of $5 billion. We now have an increase of the money supply from $1 billion to $6 billion. It's a six-fold increase simply by magic, just writing out this account, opening up the account. Is there any clinker in this? There's only one clinker. I mean, what happens is first we have a demand deposit to General Motors of $5 billion. Then General Motors spends it on all sorts of stuff, roads, paper clips, wages, workers, and the $5 billion gets diffused throughout the system. So that now I have a portion of it, you have it, your Litton Industries has it, whatever. So the total is still the $5 billion. The total is expanded, inflated money. The only possible clinker for the Bank of the World is in great shape. They just six-tuple the money supply. The only possible problem is some of you guys might want to claim gold or cash or whatever it is for the demand deposits. Then there might be in some trouble. So if one of you has $1 billion, you go to $2 billion. You have $2 billion, you go to the bank for redemption. Then the bank is in a little bit of trouble. Where are they going to get the money? And this is the only check on the Bank of the World. Of course, the next step is to eliminate the gold standard, declare the Bank of the World legal tender. So anything the bank does can't be redeemed, then you're home free. You can inflate forever. Of course, you don't have a Bank of the World. You have all sorts of thousands and thousands of banks in each country. And each bank competes with the other, and each country competes with the other. So the only check, for example, on the English banks, I was saying before, that the French banks call them for redemption, plus the internal Englishmen. That's not very great. But if you can mobilize the whole system, like the Federal Reserve System mobilizes the whole country, if you can mobilize the whole system so the banks don't really compete, so they're all getting reserves together and all induced to inflate together, then you don't have to worry about one bank cashing in another bank, because you'll have just as many people of the other bank trying to redeem from the first bank, and everybody's hotty-totty. The clearinghouse settles the whole business. You can keep inflating forever. So the only problem becomes this redemption. Now, during the free banking period before the Civil War, it's often been said that the wildcat banks expanded. I mentioned before, the reason why the bank, as much inflation as there was, which wasn't really that great before the Civil War, is because every time the banks really got into trouble on a massive scale, the state or federal government said, okay, you don't have to pay anymore for a while. You don't have to pay in gold. This permits the inflation to continue. One amusing thing is that in 1819 or 1820, I think 1820, there's a correspondence between David Ricardo, the most eminent economist in the world, and Conde Raguet, who was an excellent economist in his own right from Philadelphia, who was a hard money man. And Conde Raguet is trying to explain to Ricardo the American banking situation and having a great deal of difficulty. He's saying there's trouble, everything's inflated, and the banks are still, they're increasing the money supply, and nobody can redeem any money in gold and so forth. Ricardo's writing back and says, what do you mean they can't redeem in gold? It's illegal. The banks can't insist on somebody paying them their debt and then not pay their own debt. How can they get away with it? Why are they still in operation? Why haven't they all been closed up? This is nonsense. So Raguet writes back to him and says, look, Mr. Ricardo, you're a great economist, we love you and so forth, but you don't understand the American banking system. In the United States, everybody is either a bank director or a stockholder, or he owns money to the banks anyway, and or he's dealing business with the banks in some way. So if any outsider wanders into the situation, is not in one of these categories, and tries to redeem his money to the banks, he's immediately clobbered by everybody. He's lynched, he's driven out of town, and so forth and so on. So Ricardo was apparently never able to figure this out, dealing with lawless America. At any rate, this is what happens with the Appeals Act people. The currency school thinks that demand deposits are not really money, it's only bank notes. Bank notes is one form of warehouse receipt, and bank deposits are another. Conde Raguet and the American hard money people, the American Ricardians, William Googe and people like that, understood it. They understood demand deposits were part of the money supply, but they couldn't influence the Ricardians, because the Ricardians wouldn't pay any attention to American economists. Who are these clucks over there? We're the big shots. So there was no influence of American economists on the English economists, even though there was, of course, the other way. So they're never able to get it through their skulls until it was too late and the whole jig was up. Well, the next step in this process, in the theoretical front, essentially made by Knut Wicksell, great founder of Swedish economics, and then by Ludwig von Mises, You add on to this model, this model of money and prices going up and down as being the key, is something else. And something else makes the business cycle much tougher in a sense of being more intractable once it gets started. Something else is in the process of inflating the money supply and inflating bank credit. You're not only raising prices, I mean, that's bad enough, you're also doing something else which is in a sense even worse. You're messing up the whole production system. You're messing up the sort of things which business will invest in. You're distorting the whole production process and creating a necessity of a later recession to correct it. So now we begin to have a situation where in this model, in a way you can look at the recession as unnecessary. If the government somehow stabilizes the whole thing and irons it out, you wouldn't have any problem. But if you look at the boom as essentially not just a happy time before the recession, but as really the worst time, because the boom is the time where you have the distortion of production. Then it's important to allow the recession its head, allow the recession to iron out and correct these distortions as quickly as possible so you can get this thing over with and go back to a normal kind of pattern. The distortions are, for inflationary bank credit, are essentially overinvestment in the capital goods industries, or the so-called remote orders of production, or the higher orders of production, as the Austrians put it. In other words, things like dams, machine tools, construction, those things which are most remote from consumer goods. And these are the things which get overinvested. In other words, there's an underinvest because of the fact that the banks are expanding and inflating credit. They're pushing the rate of interest below this free market rate. They're creating a situation where too much is invested in the higher orders of production, machine tools and industrial raw materials, etc., and not enough in consumer goods. You have this distortion. And you have to keep doing this. You have to keep inflating, keep one step ahead of retribution, which is, of course, coming up and imposing what is now called a liquidity crisis in industry, where you think you can borrow another 10 million, you can't do it, and how are you going to pay for this extra costs? So once this process stops, once this inflationary process stops, then these distortions are revealed. We find out the business is overinvested in all these projects and all these plants, and the whole thing has to be liquidated as quickly as possible to get workers and resources and equipment back to the consumer goods industry to start in on a sound situation. That's in very brief terms the Austrian theory. Its policy conclusions are very simple. Its policy, even though the theory might be fairly complex, its policy conclusion is it says to the government, if you're inflating, stop it. And if you're in a recession, don't do anything and let the thing iron out as quickly as possible. In other words, a very, very extreme laissez-faire policy in this area. In the 1920s, this is reflected, as we'll see next time, in a overinvestment in capital goods industries, particularly those areas which reflect the value of capital, and the stock market and land, which are purely capital-oriented kind of thing. So this is the exact opposite sort of explanation as the usual popular explanation for depression, or the Keynesian explanation of depression. The usual explanation is, all of a sudden you're in a situation, you're in this panic setup, all of a sudden you find retailers and businessmen, they can't sell their product. And so the big cry is underconsumption. Consumers don't have enough money to pay for the hula hoops and Wheaties and that sort of stuff. Or you can say there's overproduction. Somehow we've produced too much. This is the NRA kind of thing. We have to cut down production, so keep systematically chopping up the pigs and all that sort of stuff, slaughtering the pigs. So they slaughtered pigs. Reduced production is too much. That caused a recession. If you look at it, the whole thing is a series of nonsense fallacies. The idea that you can have overproduction when half the people are starving is pretty absurd. There will never be overproduction until we reach the Garden of Eden, if we ever do. Until then, there's always scarcity, as far as I've been talking about, the abundance versus scarcity thing. There ain't no such thing as abundance in the technical economic sense. Everything is scarce. If it weren't scarce, its price would be zero. We will find out that when the liberal intellectuals are really over-affluent, we will discover this when they start burning their salary checks or salary increases. Nobody, as I know of, has been burning their salary increases. The test of overabundance is when everything's free, when you wish for the Pepsi and the Pepsi is pouring down your throat. Until we get to that stage of scarcity. That's the Garden of Eden model. The other thing is underconsumption. And that's another very peculiar thing if you look at it. How come the consumers suddenly have less money? Before that, before October 29 or whatever 1907, consumers have plenty of money. They're in great shape. All of a sudden, they haven't got any money to spend. That's kind of peculiar too. If you look at that, you find out what the consumers are really saying about this overproduction, underconsumption thing is. It's not that they can't sell their product. It's a lot of nonsense. You can always sell your product. If you have too much, if you invested in too many hula hoops, and the hula hoop craze disappears, and you're stuck with 10,000 hula hoops, and everybody else is off there on the frisbee game. You can get rid of the hula hoops. You can sell them. You can sell them by charging a penny a piece, maybe, or paying people to take it. You can always sell it. The way you sell it is by lowering the price. But that's the one thing they don't want to do, because that would mean they'd be suffering severe losses. So the whole point is not so much that there's underconsumption, but the whole point is, for some reason, businessmen have paid too much. They've bid costs up. They've bought the hula hoops or the frisbees or whatever for a price that turns out to be too high in relation to the price that they can sell it for the next guy down the consumption chain. So for some reason, there's been a cluster of entrepreneurial error. Everybody somehow has bought all this stuff at $10,000 a case, and they can only sell it for $3,000 a case. So the problem is in the price system. Something has happened to screw up the price system. And the problem is overbidding of course, and when the cause for overbidding of course is discerned by the Austrian theory, which is that businessmen have been induced by the cheapening of credit and the artificial expansion of credit into the business system to bid up wage rates and bid up costs too high in relation to because of this inflationary credit expansion, too high in relation to what they could be doing, would be getting on the free market when this whole expansion process stops. And finally, another aspect of this underconsumption nonsense is, if you look at any business cycle, including the 1929 depression, you find out the consumption industries are in relatively pretty good shape. I mean, they're less depressed than the construction and machine tool industries. So, for example, retail sales, which all the papers, you look at they're looking for the business cycle. And the first thing they look at is retail sales. How's the health of the economy? Retail sales are in great shape, so we're doing well. The thing is, retail sales are almost always in great shape. They only, from 1929 to 1933, they fell, I don't know, something like 20%. It fell less than almost anything else. At the same time, manufacturing, production, construction was falling by huge amounts, 75%, 90%, 80%. What happened, in other words, you look at consumption goods and capital goods industries. The consumption industry boom is something like this, boom bust kind of thing. And the capital goods industry is wildly going up something like that. So there's a much bigger boom in the capital goods industries and a much bigger depression in the capital goods industries, which again bears out the Austrian point. There's overinflation in the capital goods industries, and the whole thing collapses as you readjust back to a free market kind of situation. Okay, so this sort of introduces the boom bust theory and the money theory. I just want to set the stage for the 20s just for a minute by saying what happens after World War I. Since 1914, the entire international monetary system has been kaput. I mean, basically, it's been a state of advanced decay, desuetude, chaos, etc. The golden age was before 1914, essentially from 1815 to 1914. That's the classical gold standard. And ever since then, we've been trying to get the good parts of the international gold standard without the headaches, without the discipline, so-called, which governments would have to regiment themselves into obeying. So what you have is, essentially after the war, I think I mentioned that all the countries except the United States were off the gold standard because they all inflated. We now begin to see the hubris of Great Britain. Before World War I, Great Britain was the great center of international monetary affairs, international financial dealing. London was the great center of the heart of the gold standard. But now the pound was depreciated. I think the pound was down to something like $3.50 in 1920. The pound had always been $4.86. This was the classic. The basis was the different weights of gold, the definitions of the dollar and definitions of the pound. The pound was equal to $4.86. This has been the classic, the whole 19th century. This has been the fixed thing. This is now part of the British heritage. And all of a sudden, the pound is down to $3.50 because the pound had been inflated. And when you inflate the currency, the price on the world markets gets cheaper. So now the question is, what would Great Britain do? What do you do about the situation? Here you are, after the war is over, the pound is depreciated, and you have several options open to you. One option would have been to cut your losses. This would have been the rational option, by the way. Cut your losses, say, okay, it's too bad, we've inflated, and we have many more pounds in circulation than we had before, and the pound is now $3.50. We'll go back to the gold standard of $3.50, and we'll encourage all the other countries to go back at the current level, and we'll start from there. We'll cut our losses. This would have been the rational thing to do. Almost nobody was in favor of it, typically. Virtually nobody, maybe one or two economists, maverick economists here and there, said, this is really the easiest thing to do, the simplest, you have less headaches. No, this is out. So that option is crossed out, going back to gold at the new level. The consideration was adopted was the idea of going back at the old level, going back at the old 486, because British heritage is now 486. We can't accept the devalued pound. This is a terrible thing. Our credit will be doomed, and so forth and so on. So you have this quixotic exotic decision to go back at 486. There's a third plan. This is the plan of the left-wing crazy, so to speak, in those days. At least they were considered in those days, of abandoning gold altogether and just go over to fiat currency. This is the minority, much bigger than the rational minority, I must admit, but not very strong yet. When they go back at 486, by the way, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time was Winston Spencer Churchill. John Maynard Keynes writes, as far as I'm concerned, the only good thing he ever wrote, which is a little pamphlet called The Economic Consequences of Winston Churchill, predicting what was going to happen. Going to get a fantastic mess because of this insistence of going back at the old 486 par. So now the Britain has decided to go back at 486. What does this mean? How can you go back at 486? It means that now the British pound, even though its goods are priced essentially at 350 everywhere, it means the price of British goods will be astronomical compared to other markets. I mean, the British exports will be frozen out of world markets. I mean, it's really sort of a quasi-lunatic kind of policy, especially due to the fact that England lives off imports. I mean, England's a very small country, and they import food and so forth and so on. And the major exports were coal and textiles and shipbuilding. And these were sort of declining industries anyway. I mean, these are industries which are pretty well, not exactly have had it, but I mean, the hand is on the horizon for coal and textiles and shipbuilding. But at any rate, in those days, they're still pretty strong. So England has to have cheap export. I mean, it has to have a competitive kind of export system. But here we are imposing this enormous burden on the export industries. We're saying that the coal and the textiles and the ships are going to be priced now at something like 30% higher before this whole policy goes into effect. So Britain has this problem. They're committed to this 486 nonsense. And they're committed to very high prices. What can they do about it? How can they survive? As a matter of fact, what happens is that during the 1920s, when every other economy was booming, United States, Europe, Britain's economy was depressed. Britain had a 20-year depression. Because Britain has very heavy, the exports weren't going, and they had very heavy unemployment in the export industries. So what do you do about it? Well, several things. Each one, given this insane matrix here, the rest of the British policy is extremely cunning and Machiavellian to the hilt. I mean, within an unworkable policy, they did the best they could. So what do you do? First of all, they couldn't. The classical policy would have been to deflate. I mean, the 19th century policy is, all right, you want to go back at 46. Our prices are now 30% higher than the competitive. We force the price level down 30% by lowering the money supply by 30%. We put the economy through a deflationary ringer. Now, that would have been done in the old days. They couldn't do it in the 20s because they felt they couldn't do it, because now we have, after World War I, we have a very strong unionized system, bolstered in Britain, bolstered by a big unemployment insurance, national unemployment insurance scheme. So that means any worker that strikes can zip over the Unemployment Insurance Bureau and get his pay from then on. So it was impossible to deflate. They felt that it would have been like 90% unemployment, because wage rates would have been up there. So they felt it was politically impossible. If they had the guts to do it, if they had a really strong laissez-faire Tory type, they could have done it, perhaps. But anyway, they felt they couldn't do it. All right. There's a lot of labor unrest and general strikes and all that, and so they figured they couldn't deflate, and they couldn't not go back at 486 because of their cookie original decision. So what can they do about it? They wanted to keep inflating, as a matter of fact. They want to continue to have cheap money and inflate some more and get around union wage rates that way. So here they did. They wanted to inflate, or not deflate. They want to go back at 486. How can they manage this? Well, basically in two ways. One, getting everybody else to go back to the gold standard at an overvalued drachma, or whatever it is. In other words, if you're in Bulgaria and your currency is the Bulgar, and see, the thing is that Britain had a total political control of Europe by this time through the League of Nations, which was essentially a British outfit. The Financial Committee of the League of Nations was run by the British Bank of England. And so what you do is you send experts beaming into Bulgaria and Greece and Latvia and every other place you can get your mitts on. And you tell them, we want you to go back to the gold standard. None of this fiat money, none of this other thing here. We want you to go back to the gold standard at a very highly overvaluated drachma or Bulgar or whatever the currency is. So in other words, you can force Bulgaria to go back at the old par. That means the Bulgarian exports are now in big trouble, and English exports to Bulgaria are now cheaper. So in other words, the British policy then becomes this cunning Machiavellian policy of getting all the other European countries to overvalue their currency and go back to the gold standard at that level, and to work out a system with the United States, so-called gold exchange standard, which I'll talk about tomorrow night, and use the United States as the patsy in this whole situation, and then induce the United States through various sinister means to inflate also, because there's also the danger of England losing gold to us. If we kept inflating, we kept our inflation in pace with the English inflation, then Britain could not have to lose gold. So during the whole 1920s, the whole international monetary picture is a series of shoring up measures to help Britain, get out of the consequences of the decision to go back in 486. I'm going on to that tomorrow night. Thank you. Okay, back to the 1920s inflation. So in the capital, remember I said the capital goods industries are fluctuating much more intensively, much greater degree than the consumer goods industry. So this means that in the recessions, what's really going on here is the capital goods industries are collapsing, and their prices are going down much further in the capital goods industries than they are in the consumer goods industries. And this shift of price behavior serves to readjust resources, land, labor, and capital, back from the overinvested capital goods industries into the consumer goods industries. So in other words, it induces a reshuffling of resources. Now this means then that, let's say consumer goods prices go down by 20%, in a big depression, and machine tool prices go down by 45%. What's really happening here is the consumer goods prices are going up relative to other prices. So in other words, the idea that consumer goods are rising in a recession is not really a new thing. It really happens in every recession. The reason why nobody's seen this until fairly recently is this. In every other recession until 1958, every classical recession, there's also been a contraction of the money supply. And the money supply, I have a one-shot model here. So the money supply goes up and boom, it collapses in depression, and there's a bank credit contraction. As that happens, the whole ball of wax is moved downward. So the oil prices are falling. And in this sort of example, consumer goods prices falling by 15-20%, capital goods prices falling by 45%. So the consumer, when he's looking at this, he's satisfied in the sense that at least consumer goods prices are falling. But relative to other prices, consumer goods prices are going up. So, but this situation is masked, so to speak, or offset by the fact that oil prices are falling due to this monetary contraction. So the Austrian business cycle theory explains the reason why consumer goods prices go up relatively to other prices. What's happened is in the last, starting in 58, really starting in the 30s, when you get right down to it, the inflation of the 30s took place, prices were going up in the middle of a big depression. It starts in 58 again, and then 69, 71, where consumer goods prices particularly keep going up. One of the explanations for this is that there is now the political rule in the United States of bank credit, money supply and bank credit shall never be allowed to fall again. Well, if the money supply can't fall ever again, this means the price level won't fall ever again. And so the price level, this process of the whole price level falling, which masked this process, is now removed. The veil is taken off. You strip away one veil, and you find out, by God, consumer goods prices are going up in a recession. It's a monstrous thing. But the point is, it's been happening all the time, but its effects have been offset by deflation. This is one of the great things about deflation. The great thing about deflation is, the good thing about depression is the prices fall. I mean, from the point of view of the consumer, which should be the general point of view. My father, for example, those who happened to be employed during the Great Depression were doing pretty well. And my father's most prosperous time of his entire life was during the Great Depression in the 30s, because he happened to continue to be employed, and prices were collapsing, and he bought all his furniture and so forth and so on. So, but now we have a situation due to the Keynesian, the wise measures of the Keynesian economics and the various Democratic and Republican administrations. We now have a situation where every time we have a recession, we won't be able to enjoy falling prices. The prices are going to keep going up. We're going to suffer the worst of both worlds, so to speak. We're going to have bankruptcies and unemployment, et cetera, and falling production and prices going up. It's going to be a beautiful system. Beautiful system to look forward to. So this essentially is what happens. But neither the Keynesian nor the Friedmanite business cycle theories have any explanation for this at all. And it's only the Austrian theory both in terms of the consequences on the micro system, so to speak, of the macro movements. As a matter of fact, this is a favorite story which I've repeated at least a dozen times or so, which I'll repeat again because it fits in. It's a great story. One of my professors at Columbia, when I was going to graduate school, was Arthur F. Burns. In those days, he was a high theorist and not interested in politics. And he was tapped by the Rockefeller Axis, and when Eisenhower became president, he became the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And when he left, incidentally, it's interesting what happened to a professor, enter his government, because before he left for Washington, his lectures were fantastic. Brilliant theoretical analyses of Keynes and Chamberlain and Robinson and all the rest of it. And when he gets back from the government after several years in the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, his lectures consist of anecdotes about what he said to Eisenhower, what Eisenhower said to him, what he said to Rockefeller, and so forth and so on. Sort of anecdotal history of his life. And at any rate, he gives us these series of lectures just as he was getting out, and just after he'd gotten out. And just when the recession of '58 was hitting, which was the first time it was officially recognized we had this peculiar phenomenon of an inflationary recession. An inflationary recession violates all the rules, all the Keynesian rules and all the Freemanite rules, because what you're supposed to be doing in a recession, according to the Keynesians, when you see a recession, you pump spending into the system, get deficits, pump spending in, prime the pump, etc., and lift the economy up. At least in the old Chicago school theory, you pump money into the system. You don't bother with spending, you concentrate on the money supply, and you pump that in. And the eclectic types who don't want to choose between Keynesianism and Chicagoism say you pump both in. You may as well push both stops. So you pump in spending and you have deficits, and why not? Have deficits and increase in inflation. And then what you're supposed to do in the boom, you see inflation running away, you go to the other set of dials and you say, okay, now we pull spending out of the system by raising taxes, or we contract the money supply, or whatever. So all of a sudden, here we have a situation. But all this sort of contra-cyclical policy, that's called, rests on a couple of key assumptions, one of which is all things are moving in the same direction. In other words, that during a boom, prices are going up and spending is going up, etc. And during a recession, prices are falling and you have bankruptcies and unemployment. So Burns was outlining this whole doctrine. I was supposed to be a neutral observer of this thing. And I couldn't refrain from plunging into the situation, as is my wont. So I said, well, Professor Burns, this is during the question period, what happens if you continue to have this inflationary recession? And what happens, what policies would you advocate for in a recession, and prices are going up and unemployment is, everything else is falling, unemployment is increasing, etc. So he says, well, it's not going to happen now because we're going to pull, 58 recession is almost over, and 2 months will be out of it, there's no real problem. And I said, okay, conceding that, what would you advise if sometime in the future we will have an inflationary recession? And he stops a minute and he says, well, he says, he speaks like W.C. Fields without the humor. This is he says, well, he says, in that case we don't have to resign. So he hasn't resigned, of course. Nobody resigned during this. But it was really, an admission of the fact that these people really have no answer to the current setup. Okay, back to the 1920s. I think that's another rule Forrest would concede, another rule of bureaucracy. Nobody ever resigns. I mean, it's sort of like once in a million, somebody actually gets out. Stevenson used to call it boring from within or something, or complaining. Okay, so we have England in this pickle, as I was talking about. Okay, England then sets out on its grand design of conning, bludgeoning, whatever, all the other countries to inflate, European countries to go back to the gold standard, overvalued zloty or whatever the currency is, and the United States to play along with the system. The grand British plan was unfolded at the Genoa Conference of 1922, which is very little known in the textbooks. It was one of the key events in modern 20th century monetary history. The theoretics of it was worked out by a Mephistophelian economic theorist working for the Bank of England, Sir Ralph Hortrey, a very distinguished economist, works out the essentials of this plan. The big clout, the person running the English monetary system during this whole period, was the head of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, a key figure in this whole business. Here, the conspiracy theory works beautifully. I mean, almost acknowledged by everybody dealing with this whole thing. Because what happened was Norman and Benjamin Strong had a constant series of secret conferences, and they really were secret, because Strong didn't want the Washington authorities to find out about it. There was a certain suspicion of England among the Midwest masses, and so forth. And Washington liked this whole, Washington was upset and they didn't know what's going on here. So Strong and Norman have secret conferences, and what they do every year, every 6 months, Ben Strong would sort of or stretches arms one day, stretches shoulders, and say, "Well, fellas, I'm pretty tired. I think I'm going up to Saratoga for vacation." And you go up to Saratoga for vacation. You check in at the big hotel there. Meantime, Norman would zip over, not telling anybody in the press. He would come over to the same hotel in Saratoga, and he'd register as Professor Skinner for some reason. I didn't check up about why he used this alias, Professor Skinner. Nothing to do with the psychologist Skinner. And he registers as Professor Skinner. They have these secret talks, and then Norman slips out in the middle of the night, and Strong slips back. And so there's a very strong connection. Most historians interpret this, and I did a little bit myself, of Norman is exerting a sort of Svengali personal influence on Strong. Well, there might have been some of that involved. But one of the things which is usually overlooked, of course, is, you can hear it now, and say this in unison, is the influence of the Morgans. Benjamin Strong, I've already said, was a virtually Morgan representative in this whole thing. With Montague Norman, first of all, the J.P. Morgan Company continues to be the fiscal agent for the Bank of England during this whole period. I mean, they acknowledge fiscal agent. And second of all, Montague Norman came from an old international banking family. He was a former partner of the London investment banking firm of Brown Shipley and Company, which was the New York branch or whatever, Brown Brothers Company in New York, the great international banking firm, investment banking firm. And he personally had worked Montague Norman had worked in Brown Brothers and Company in New York for several years, and his grandfather had been a partner of the firm. There's a whole tradition in the family. Brown Brothers later, of course, becomes Brown Brothers Harriman, and was in many ways associated with the House of Morgan in this international banking consortium. So we have the Morgan thread running through the charisma, the Svengali influence, and all the rest of it. So reinforcing the two of them, and we'll take our choices of which was the more important. At any rate, so we have the Genoa Conference, 1922, in which England unveils the master plan. The master plan is essentially like this. Instead of having, before the war, if you see any resemblances between this and Bretton Woods, that's it. It's virtually Bretton Woods prefigured. The classical gold standards, remember, each country has their own currency, notes and deposits, pyramid on top of gold. So this would be, say, pounds, and this would be francs, and so forth. The French would have gold, and the Germans would have marks, and so forth and so on. So this is the classical gold standard system. Now we have another system invented by England and pushed through the whole world, called the gold exchange standard. A new razzle-dazzle thing which Norman has come up with. Norman and Hawtrey come up with. So instead of having the gold standard, we have the gold exchange standard, which everybody said, well, it'll be the same thing as the old gold standard. Same thing, just more economical. We'll economize on reserves. Whenever any banker talks about economizing on reserves, look, head for the hills. It means inflation is coming. So the theory now is, all these other countries, Bulgaria and Greece and Latvia and all the others, are supposed to pyramid their stuff, not on their own gold supply. Nobody's supposed to have gold anymore. It's obsolete. Send all the gold to Washington and London. That was the concept. So all these other countries, Bulgaria, let's say, has the Bulgar, the Zloty, whatever the Bulgarian currency is, they're pyramiding Bulgarian notes on deposits on top of now, not gold or not gold, but the pound, the British pound or the dollar. And the same thing happens with Greece and so forth and so on. You have all these guys, you have, in other words, this whole, an international system of all these guys pyramiding notes and deposits on top of the pound. In other words, on top of sterling reserves, pound sterling reserves, which they hold in London, consisting of, the bank deposits in London were short-term treasury bills. And then also on the pound is supposed to be pyramided on top of dollars. The British are supposed to be holding not really gold so much, but dollars. But these two currencies, these two base currencies, are called the key currencies of the system. So several banks that are told and induced and arms twisted, etc., to take them to, why mess around with gold? Gold is unproductive. Keep your money in London. Keep it in Washington. Keep it especially in London. And it'll be earning interest for you, and so forth and so on. What happens, the result of this cunning diabolic scheme is, Britain has its deficit in the balance of payments, but nobody, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, etc., they don't call on Britain to repay in gold anymore because they're using the pounds as the reserves to pyramid their own stuff on top of. So this looks like an endless thing. It looks like a new magic thing. It's like a perpetual motion machine, as far as mentioned the other day. Boy, oh boy, this is terrific. Britain can inflate as much as they want, and the deficit of the balance of payments, and the money flows out, but instead of the France or Germany or whatever calling upon Britain for redemption, they use these pounds as part of their own money base of money supply. They put them on top of that, and Britain can inflate forever, and no retribution will ever be subject upon it. This, of course, is what happened with Bretton Woods from 1944 to 1971, except the United States pushes Britain out as a key currency and takes over. It's essentially the same damn thing. And retribution comes eventually, but it takes quite a while. So, Keynes' famous statement is that in the long run we're all dead, so we shouldn't worry about the long run. But one of the jokes of history is that we're now in the long run. I mean, Keynes is dead and we're here. We're suffering in the long run. To bolster this idea of the gold exchange standard key currency, and of course this is really required, obviously, from it. You tell the public, you don't need any gold coins anymore. Forget gold coins. It's a relic of barbarism. Give it away to your kids at Christmas, maybe, but outside that, forget it. And so Britain and, of course, these other countries don't redeem their money in gold anymore. They redeem it in gold coins anymore. They redeem it in gold bullion, if they redeem it at all. The idea is leave gold for your international transactions, the big transactions. The gold bullion, the gold bar is what it is. Forrest mentioned gold bar the other day. It's something like $1,100 or whatever. And so you can't break the bar down. I mean, gold coins can be used by everybody in everyday transactions. If you can't redeem money in less than on a gold bar, then you're limiting the whole thing to international trade and to big business and so forth. You're taking gold out of the system, in effect. So in addition, as a corollary to gold exchange standard, we have the gold bullion standard. Only the United States remains on gold coins, and we're just trying to discourage it as much as possible. We're laughing. We're trying to sneer at it and say, okay, you can get gold coins if you want, but it's really, you're really being pretty ridiculous. You're an old rube, and you don't understand modern banking, that sort of stuff. But we still were at least nominally on a gold coin standard, and the other countries are now being more sophisticated and we're piling everything on top of the dollar and top of the pound. And the third arm of this, as I mentioned, is that Britain is inducing or forcing Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece to go back and overvalue zlotys and overvalued drachmas, etc., in order to hurt their exports and stimulate British exports to those countries. And also, those countries which are too backward to have a central bank, Britain forced them to have a central bank, because if you don't have a central bank, you can't really inflate very well. You can't play your part on the great Genoa Conference game. So Britain controlling Montague Norman and his his agents and theoreticians, controlling the Financial Committee of the League of Nations, uses their fantastic political and economic clout to rub all these guys in a line, set up a central bank for them, get them to come back to the gold bullion standard, the gold exchange standard, and the overvalued zloty, etc., etc. Essentially, Britain was running, and then one way or the other, the monetary and financial systems of at least the following countries in Europe: Austria, Hungary, Danzig, Estonia, Greece, Bulgaria, Belgium, Norway, Italy, Portugal, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Romania. Virtually all of Europe, with the exception of France, which was going to go back at hard money, but France was induced by British pleading, on their knees, please, don't call on sterling for redemption because we, break the whole system. And so France was piling up sterling reserves also. All of this was done, incidentally, with conjunction and cooperation of the paternal blessings of J.P. Morgan and Company, which helped as much as they could in fueling the thing, or lending money to the Bank of Yugoslavia to get the thing going, and so forth. Okay, but the key to making the thing work was the cooperation of good old Uncle Sap down here. Was the only country was continuing on the gold coin standard. It's supposed to be the basis of this whole. And we had to keep inflating. We had to make sure that Britain wasn't losing too much gold to us because of their inflationary policies. We obliged them. As soon as Norman was appointed, as a matter of fact, during World War I, Benjamin Strong sends him a letter hastening the promise of services. So it's a rather oddly phrased letter, as I remember it. It was almost like pledging your fealty to your master. Pledging us do everything he can to help him. And in 1920, Norman starts making these annual trips to the United States to see Strong, and Strong makes trips to see Norman, etc., etc. And they have this secret thing, and then trips to Saratoga and so forth. Well, there's several big inflationary impetuses in this thing. One of them was the first big one was 1924, when the Federal Reserve System enters the open market, dictated by Strong, and buys an enormous amount of government securities in order to push down interest rates and inflate the money supply in the United States and keep prices up again. What had happened was, this is supposed to smooth the way for Great Britain. Great Britain was going to go back to gold in 1925, so we had to inflate to help us to smooth this process along. Actually, what had happened was that the pound, after Britain announces the fact, we're going back to the pound of 486 in 1925. The pound, of course, shoots up again. It goes back to about 470, but $4.70. But in 1923, from 1923 to 1924, the British financial policy was so unsound and was so inflationary that the pound dropped anyway, even though Britain was saying in 1 year we're going back at 486. Still, the value of the pound on the international foreign exchange market drops from $4.70 to $4.32 by mid-1924. So Britain was in very bad shape here. Here's really telling everybody, in 1925 we're going back, we're going 486, we forced all these guys to adopt all this stuff, we're in great shape. And here they are, here on the world market, the pound was down at 432. So this is a crisis. So strong, the woman calls on strong to inflate, strong inflates, and the British pound strengthens again, goes back up to $4.78 because the United States prices are rising. Actually, there are two things involved here. When the Federal Reserve buys government securities in the open market, they're doing two things. One, you're inflating the money supply, bank deposits, and you're pushing U.S. prices up. You're also, at least temporarily, pushing down American interest rates. Obviously, the government floods in and buys all this stuff. The demand for bonds goes up, it means the interest rates fall. And so you're pushing down interest rates. And when you're pushing down interest rates, much of short-term world capital, at least, and even long-term world capital, depends on where you can get a higher interest return. If you can get 7% in the United States and 3% in England, there's not too much world capital that's going to remain in England. So you have this tendency toward uniformity. So we also try to push down our interest rates in order to keep Britain from losing gold to the United States. It's a double-pronged thing. And it worked. It worked in the sense that immediately, in a few months, the pound strengthens again, goes up to 478, and they're ready to go back to this gold exchange standard. I mean, go on to the gold exchange standard. This is a deliberate policy. It's strong rights to Andrew Mellon on May 17, 1924. Andrew Mellon is the Secretary of the Treasury. Of course, we don't have to wonder which interest Andrew Mellon represents, because Andrew Mellon is Andrew Mellon, owns all of Pittsburgh. Okay. Plus the Gulf Oil Company and Alcoa and a bunch of other things. Anyway, strong rights to Mellon. He says, the burden of this readjustment, by this he means, well, he starts off by saying we have to raise the United States price levels relative to Great Britain, and we have to lower American interest rates relative to Great Britain in order to permit Great Britain to, quote, return to gold, unquote. It really wasn't much a return. It was really advancing onto this peculiar new abortion of the system. Anyway, so Strong writes, quote, the burden of this readjustment must fall more largely upon us than upon them, Great Britain. It will be difficult politically and socially for the British government and the Bank of England to face a price liquidation in England. In other words, to take the route of deflating. So it will be difficult politically and socially. In face of the fact that their trade is poor, and they have over 1 million unemployed receiving government aid. So we're going to do this to help Britain. So, for example, while in 1922 and 1923, American interest rate on American bills in New York was above the rate in London, by mid-1924, the Federal Reserve System had managed to push interest rates in New York below those of London. This checked the gold outflow from London. Also in 1925, the United States, helped by the New York Fed, lends Great Britain a line of credit in gold of up to $200 million to be there in case they need it at any moment. And J.P. Morgan and Company authorizes a line of credit of $100 million to be subsidized in complicated ways by the Federal Reserve System, also in case the Bank of England needs it. And similar credit by the New York Fed similar lines of credit was extended, again to permit these countries to come back to this kind of system, to the central banks of Belgium, Poland, and Italy. First of all, you're pumping more money into the system. There's a lot of money around. All right, so there's money to lend out. The banks have more money to lend out. And secondly, if you lower interest rates in the United States, you're making foreign lending more attractive. So if the interest rate is only 3% in the United States, you can get 10% in Bulgaria. You might be stimulated to start lending money to Bulgaria. So one of the things that happens then is the stimulation of a massive private foreign lending program by American banks and American citizens abroad. Banks were involved as export underwriters, as lenders, underwriters, commissions on loans, etc. The foreign lending system worked something like sort of like a private version of the governmental foreign aid after World War II. There weren't too many U.S. government loans to Europe in the 1920s, but there were a lot of private loans on this basis. There were a lot of loans to German municipalities, for example. So every German city and township could build big city halls, that sort of thing, statues or whatever the statues were. So there's an enormous amount of malinvestment in this whole thing. The peculiar thing here is this. The United States wants to stimulate our American exports. There are two ways in which the American export industry can be successful, so to speak. One is to have low tariffs so that we can sell machinery, automobiles, and whatever abroad, and then they can sell whatever, food or whatever to us, or Swiss clocks or whatever to us. If we have low tariffs, this permits this interchange, and our imports can then pay for our exports. But we didn't want that. We wanted a high tariff. Republican policy has always been high tariff, because we also want to protect the domestic industries from their more efficient competitors abroad. So how can we do this? How can we stimulate American exports and still protect domestic industries by keeping out American imports? This is the old mercantilist bag, of course. We're back now. We haven't learned anything since 1650 or whatever. So how are we going to do this? Well, one way of doing it, obviously it can't last forever, but one way of doing it is to lend them the money. Keep the European goods out, and then lend the Europeans the money to buy our products, buy our exports. It sounds kind of crazy, but the point is, look at who's benefiting from it. The domestic industries are benefiting from the tariff protection, and the export industries are benefiting from the fact that all the money is rooting back, going from the American investor back to the English or Bulgarian or whatever importer, and then back to the American exporter. Now, of course, we've changed that. We have the American taxpayer fueling the whole thing because it's a more permanent kind of process. So this is obviously a kind of shaky system. I mean, it rests on continuing to keep lending money, keep one step ahead of retribution in a sense. Because somewhere, somehow, the foreign countries are going to have to earn dollars in some way in order to pay for all these exports. I mean, it's impossible to think of these loans going on forever. I mean, loans are also supposedly based on repayment, how the Europeans are going to repay the loans if they can't earn any dollars by exporting products to the United States. Okay, so we have this other peculiar system now. We have high U.S. tariff wall, and we have foreign loans to allow the Europeans to buy our exports. The farmers, of course, want a stimulation. The farmers are exporters, the export industry. They were very happy with this whole thing. And Benjamin Strong was trying to rationalize this policy to the masses. He didn't say we have to help England. He said we have to keep up farm prices. And this, of course, everybody said very ha-cha. And this was the sort of the public face of the thing. The farmers want us to stimulate. The farmers it's a really peculiar thing. I don't want to get into too much in the farm program again, but it's kind of peculiar. The farmers look back to the parity thing, an average of 1909 or 1910 to 1914, when the farmers, because of the impending war in Europe, the farmers are the highest proportionate farm price per other price in the history of the country. And this is the golden age. They're looking at everything since then and trying to get back to force all of us to wrench ourselves back into this 1909, 1914 kind of setup. Okay, the first great boom in foreign lending begins with the Federal Reserve inflation in late 21, early 22, and then it falls back again, and then it's stimulated once more by this 24 inflation that I mentioned. And it's also this foreign lending, by the way, was helped along by what's called on sources a deluge of U.S. government and banking propaganda, enormous amount of propaganda beamed to the public about, quote, the economic necessity to the United States of foreign lending. It's a peculiar thing, by the way. I haven't got, again, time to go into this, but there arises in the late 19th century among the theoreticians, a small knot of apocalyptic theoreticians around Teddy Roosevelt, Brooks Adams and Henry Adams and Captain Mann and so forth, sort of Leninism in reverse. Here are the guys that come to the conclusion that capitalism is sunk unless you have foreign markets, unless you can, because there's enormous surplus piling up. We can't buy the surplus. We have to open up the other countries by any means necessary, to use the current phraseology, and force them to take our products. Otherwise, capitalism is doomed. This is Lenin's interpretation from the other side. The only difference is these guys say, therefore, we have to go in and smash everybody and force them to buy our exports. And they keep saying this all the time. And presumably, some of these people believe it. And William Appleton Williams and his students look at this situation and think that this reflects the reality. In other words, they think that the Lenin-Brooks-Adams analysis is correct, and therefore the capitalism, in order to sustain itself, has to keep it being imperialistic and forcing everybody to buy our products, etc. So this, I think, is a completely faulty analysis situation. Obviously, some exporters would like to force the government to force other people to buy their products. That's a very different thing than saying that capitalism, the health of the capitalist system, requires this. Because there always have been, of course, businessmen looking for special privileges as against their competitors, against the consumer, and so forth. It's a very different kind of, obviously, analysis. Okay, so this resumption of U.S. inflation in 24 picks the foreign lending boom up, and it carries on a mighty foreign lending boom in the United States to foreign countries until 1928. In the meantime, while this is going on, Herbert Hoover, the Department of Commerce, is trying to stimulate exports in all sorts of other ways, trying to get export cartels and stimulating foreign loans and so forth. As a matter of fact, Hoover is so enthusiastic about foreign lending, but he says that even bad loans are really good, even if the loan will be defaulted eventually, because they help exports. Interesting analysis. And yet, while this was going on, of course, Norman is griping privately. I mean, publicly, the British are falling all over Benjamin Strong and saying he's the greatest guy in the history of the world, and so forth and so on. In private, Norman's constantly griping about Strong isn't doing enough. Why isn't he inflating more? Why isn't he, he's being ungrateful and so forth. For example, by 1919, even as early as 1919, Basil Blackett was urging Strong to let United States prices rise a little more. Here we are in a fantastic boom, 1919-20, prices skyrocketing, and Blackett is complaining, he says, keep it going up. And Norman is constantly pressing throughout, almost continually in this whole thing. Finally, in 1924, of course, Norman is very happy that Strong has this big inflationary push. And he writes to Strong, and he says, "You must continue with easy money and foreign loans." It's great, great, hooray. But privately, he's still right that the United States wasn't inflating enough. Should still be doing more. Okay, but then I see it's like a sort of it's really giving like an injection to a horse. You dope the horse runs a lot, and it, after a while it collapses. So we have this inflationary injection, and everything's inflating, and the interest rates are down. But then what happens? There's been a couple of years by 1926, 27. American prices start falling again, and interest rates are going up, and Britain is in trouble again. Britain is, of course, continuing its inflationary cheap money policy. And by this time, Britain is going back to the gold standards. They're even worse off than they were in the early 20s. Heavy unemployment in export industries and so forth, and British gold is flowing into the United States. And Britain insists on keeping their interest rate low. They don't take the classical 19th century method of raising interest rates in order to keep gold from going up. They have to keep this inflationary policy. That's a given. So what can they do about it? Well, they have to pressure us for another big dose. We dope the horse once more. Another big dose of American inflation. Notice how short run this whole thing is. And nobody really. I think I may have mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. In the textbooks, they always say private people are narrow-minded. They're only looking for the next couple of years or whatever. It's the government that's far-sighted. The government that sees clearly plans for 100 years in the future. Plans for the whole human race. Actually, nobody is shorter range than the government. The government, they're babying everything along to the next election, to the fall, get past this crisis, get past that, as long as they're in office. And they don't really care what happens in 5 or 10 years. And it's obvious with this thing. Nobody looks ahead and says, well, what happened? You can't keep doing this indefinitely. Just baby along another 6 months, another 3 months. I mean, who cares? We'll be out of office then or whatever. The world might explode and the Martians might come back or whatever. By the time retribution, catches up with us. And Britain and Benjamin Strong is buying sterling to try to keep the pound rate up. Once again, the time has come for another big dose of inflation. And as Benjamin Strong tells Charles Rees, who was the brilliant French economist, was very much opposed to this whole thing, saw what was going on. He represented the Bank of France in this situation. They have a 4-man conference, big 4 central bank conference in New York. Again, secret, of course. Nobody's supposed to know about it. In July 1927, consisting of Norman, Strong, Rees, and Hjalmar Schacht, who was the head of the German Reichsbank. And the idea was that if Norman and Strong had agreed what was going to happen beforehand, they were trying to induce the other 2 guys to go along with a big inflationary push. And Strong gaily tells Rees, I'm going to give a little coup de whiskey to the stock market. A little coup de whiskey, that was a very, very nice phrase there. So Schacht was a sort of sound money type. Schacht and Rees was very sort of semi-Austrian in his own. He's really something like Willis and Anderson's whole analysis. Rees was horrified, and Schacht was horrified, and they go home very quickly. And Norman and Strong carry this forward. They're disappointed that Schacht and Rees don't want to inflate together, because it'd be nice if everybody can inflate at once. You solve a lot of the problems of losing gold to other countries. But anyway, so that's too bad. And so they held this. I really don't know if this has any significance or not, but I toss it out to future historians to look into it, perhaps. This secret conference was held at the Long Island estate of Ogden Mills and Mrs. Ruth Pratt of the Standard Oil Pratt family. Whether that has any significance, whether they just had an empty house available, I don't know. At any rate, so Norman and Strong agree they're going to keep buying gold. They're going to have another mighty dose of inflation in the United States. They're going to expand credit once again, raise prices again, and lower American interest rates. So Strong does this. We have another massive purchase by the Federal Reserve of government securities in the open market. This was the biggest single inflationary dose of the 1920s, this 1927 dose. The British press was delighted. They were falling all over themselves. Fantastic thing. The Banker, the London magazine, The Banker, had already said after the 1924 thing, they already had written that Benjamin Strong wrote about Benjamin Strong, quote, "No better friend of England has existed," and praised, quote, "the energy and skillfulness that he's given to the service of England." Interesting. This is the sort of thing that sent Colonel McCormick up the wall. And also went on to say, this is the English magazine, The Banker, that Strong's name should be associated with that of Mr. Page as a friend of England in her greatest need. Walter Hines Page, of course, is the American ambassador to England, whom Mencken, I think, justly referred to as Anglo-maniacal in his intensity of getting us into the war. A leading American banker admitted to Ben Anderson in late 1926 that this cheap money policy, which Strong was putting into effect, would have very bad American consequences in the United States. But he said, quote, "that cannot be helped. It is the price we must pay for helping Europe," unquote. One of the problems is that this banker, had decided that we would have to pay the price, but the rest of us weren't consulted about this. The unemployed and so forth, the guys are going to starve during the Depression. We're not consulted on this, this decision. That's the use of the word "we," which is always a key thing in social philosophy. It's like the famous Keynesian phrase, the public debt doesn't mean anything, because we owe it to ourselves. Of course, the big question there, who's the we and who's the ourselves? Well, there are different sets of people. Okay, so this 1927 push was the largest single rate of increase in bank reserves in the 20s. Herbert Hoover was critical from 1924 on of this whole thing. He was very critical of the stock market boom. This would lead again to sort of a Hoover-Rockefeller thing. Hoover was critical of the inflationary aspect of the whole thing. He called Benjamin Strong, quote, "a mental annex to Europe," unquote. But Coolidge and Mellon were very much in favor of this. Coolidge, incidentally, did not really snooze his way through the White House. I wish he had. Every once in a while, he'd wake up and he'd endorse the Strong policy. And another thing he'd do, he'd wake up and he'd call for increases in the stock market. There's a great article, I think, sometime in 1928 in the Atlantic Monthly by Ralph Roby, who was a student of Benjamin Beckhart, who was a student of H. Parker Willis. I guess he was a student of Willis himself. He wrote a great article in the Atlantic Monthly entitled "The Capeadors of Wall Street," and he referring to Coolidge and Mellon, because every time the stock market would flag a little bit, Coolidge and Mellon would rush into the print and make statements like, the stock market is getting too low again, it should be higher, and America's in great shape, and keep buying stock and that sort of stuff, and I will buy stock at this level. And all sorts of statements designed to try to boost the stock market every time it showed signs of relaxing a little bit. There was a private memorandum written about in 1928 by an assistant, an aide to Strong, written to an English banker, a very prominent banker, Sir Ace Alexander Salter. And he's trying to explain why Strong couldn't have an open, formal conference, with all the central banks, and have it, openly in Washington and New York, and have big publicity about it, and have a formal Bretton Woods kind of arrangement. And why you need this secrecy. And he says Strong has to, quote, "consider the viewpoint of the American public." And therefore keep it secret. Because the American public has this prejudice against the League of Nations, against us interfering in other people's affairs, and they're interfering in our affairs, and it's very hampering the whole thing. And he says, to illustrate how inflamed public or political opinion might easily become when the results of past decisions become evident, he cites the outcry against certain specific excesses in the stock market. He says, people are belly aching with this big stock boom, and that's why we have to keep the thing secret. I like that phrase, how inflamed public opinion might easily become when the results of past decisions become evident. That's a really striking phrase. It means when somebody makes a secret decision to get into Vietnam or something, in 5 years the results become evident, then the public might become inflamed about it. So that's why we have to keep the decision secret. Strong said that quote, "the very few people indeed realized that we were now paying the penalty for the decision which was reached early in 1924. This is 1928. Decision reached early in 1924 to help the rest of the world back to a sound financial and monetary basis." Why? Because the reason why I didn't realize, nobody told them either about the original decision or about what's going to happen when the original decision goes into effect. In short, if the American people were allowed to know what had been transacted in their name and the ensuing penalties they were forced to pay because of these decisions, they would rise up in their wrath. That's presumably what Strong is saying. Okay, after the 1927 coup de whiskey, the New York Fed in 1927 through 1929 bought very heavily in foreign commercial bills to try to stem any gold flow from Europe and to give the Europeans, again, more money to buy our exports. We bought sterling bills very heavily. The idea that we have to keep buying sterling bills to keep the sterling, keep gold flowing back to Britain and prop the sterling up. Because sterling is very weak shape here. Obviously, the pound is very heavily overvalued. And the French are piling up sterling balances. The British are pleading with them, don't try to redeem in gold, we're going to wreck the system, and so forth. Again, this inflationary thing has a temporary success at 27, 28. Gold flows out again, foreign prices go up, the pound strengthens a little bit, exports rise, and so forth. British exports rise, and so forth. Foreign loans have stimulated new heights being reached in mid-1928. But by mid-1928, the coup de whiskey, the whiskey disappears from the system of the British horse, so to speak. And the pound starts sagging again, and exports fall, foreign prices fall, foreign loans are slumping. But one reason why foreign loans are slumping is kind of ironic. As the stock market begins to really take off into the stratosphere, everybody says, why should we lend money to foreigners? We're going to invest in the stock market. That's what we're really getting there. We're tripling our money every week or whatever. So foreign loans begin drying up. And President Coolidge continues his capiador role till the very last day that he leaves office in March 1929. Coolidge says the U.S. prosperity is absolutely sound. And stocks are, quote, cheap at current prices, unquote. Really, has reached lunar proportions up there. And one interesting thing is, which I'm sure Forrest will be interested in particularly, is that one of the leading bull market speculators in this period, in the late 1920s, was William C. Durant, who was one of the early General Motors people who was kicked out by Sloan and DuPont when they reorganized General Motors. Now found his niche in the crash. Found a niche in the stock market. And he was constantly praising Coolidge and Mellon for cheap money and for their statements and boosting the stock market. He collapsed during the crash. Social Darwinism came to William C. Durant. So the stock market crash. Finally, the way this thing really stops is that Benjamin, as Harry Elmer Barnes wrote in a letter about somebody else, finally God snatched Benjamin Strong. And he died in late 1928, and then this sort of ended, really, the big inflationary push. His assistants try to continue on the same thing. They didn't have the charisma of Strong, and the control of the Federal Reserve System shifts back to Washington. And they stumble around in very sort of confused fashion. And by early 1929, they're no longer increasing the money supply. Money supply continues level, which means this process, this big money inflation stops. And when money inflation stops, the recession begins, as Austrian theory, even Friedmanite theory predicts. And so the crash, really, the industrial economy turns down around mid-1929, June and July. Industrial production began to fall. The stock market, of course, has this big collapse in October. There were three basic means by which the Federal Reserve System inflated in the 20s, all of them fairly new, really brand new to the 20s, great new breakthroughs in monetary policy. One was the open market purchases, which I already mentioned. Two was the rediscount rate. Rediscount rate is not as important as open market purchases, but it has a certain role. Remember Walter Bagehot in the 19th century in Britain had defined the key role of the central bank is to always be the lender of last resort, to bail out any bank that is overexpanded and in danger of collapse. Well, the idea, though, the classical 19th century bailer out, lender of last resort theory was that the central bank should keep its rediscount rate, in other words, the rate at which it lends money to the banks, at a so-called penalty level, in other words, higher than the market. So if the bank can lend money out at 8%, let's say, and if it gets into trouble, the central bank rate should be higher than 8%, should be, let's say, 10%, which penalizes the banks and induces them to get into a sound position and get out of debt as quickly as possible. So the classical theory of central bank rediscounting was a penalty rate. In the early 1920s, Strong and the Federal Reserve changed this whole policy and keep the Federal Reserve rate below the market, below everything else. Instead of having it 10%, you have it down to 6 or 5, 4, whatever the thing is. This, of course, stimulates bank lending. And this increases bank reserves and your pyramid on top of that, and so forth. So this is an extremely inflationary kind of thing. Fortunately, the banks usually don't like to be in debt to the Federal Reserve, so this has to limit the use of this, but it's still important nevertheless. The idea, again, was to make credit, quote, more elastic, unquote. In connection with this, I have a statement reminiscing by Secretary of Treasury William Gibbs McAdoo about the purpose of the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. He says, quote, "The primary purpose of the Federal Reserve Act was to alter and strengthen our banking system that the enlarged credit resources demanded by the needs of business and agriculture will come almost automatically into existence and at rates of interest low enough to stimulate, protect, and prosper all kinds of legitimate business." They're really saying it's for inflationary purposes, for cheap credit. Okay, so another thing was to keep the discount rate below the market instead of above it. And the third thing was a very peculiar thing, which I already alluded to, the acceptance capers, the grand acceptance caper. It's really almost bizarre. I don't want to go into it in great detail. The point is that the American business system had always been a so-called single name, rest on so-called single name credit. I lend money from Bill Beach. I write out an IOU, and Bill Beach keeps it, and then he calls upon redemption in 3 months or whatever. In Europe, on the other hand, the so-called acceptance system had become the developed system, where you have acceptance dealers, acceptance banks, which endorse this paper, and then call upon the debtor for redemption. So, the Federal Reserve, after World War I, embarks on the peculiar policy of trying to create in the United States a whole new acceptance market. And obviously, this is connected with foreign trade. The fact this will ease the idea of buying and selling abroad, especially lending money abroad, because acceptances were only used in Europe. But the way they did it, the way the Federal Reserve did it, they announced they stood ready to buy all acceptances that would be offered to it, irregardless, so to speak. Provided, all acceptances that are offered to it at a very cheap rate, heavily subsidized rate. In 1928, for example, the Fed begins to get a little scared and tries to restrict credit, tries to hold back on buying open market purchases. Then the market turns to acceptances, and they start generating acceptances, and they force the Fed to buy them at a cheap rate. And this gives more reserves to the banks. Forced because the Fed has announced as one of their great givens that we will buy all acceptances offered to us at a cheap rate. But there's another interesting thing about this acceptance policy. The Federal Reserve said they would only buy acceptances from acceptance banks and not directly from the banks. They would only buy them from the acceptance dealer, acceptance houses. And they would only buy from acceptance houses that are very large. They're worth more than $1 million capitalization. This restricts the whole thing to a few pet acceptance houses. And of course, this gives a lot of moolah to the pet acceptance, to these few special acceptance houses. So most historians dealing with this policy can't understand, why does the Fed do this? It's crazy. They're tying their own hands in there. And why they're trying to generate a whole acceptance market that doesn't exist, and subsidizing a market that doesn't exist, so forth and so on. And really, only a certain dose of conspiracy analysis can explain this whole thing as anything other than pure irrationality on part of the Fed. As I mentioned, Paul Warburg, one of the great founders of the Federal Reserve System, one of the guys who wrote the Jekyll Island Plan, one of the head of the Federal Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve System, and a member of the Federal Reserve Board, was also one of the world's top acceptance bankers. He was the chairman of the board of International Acceptance Corporation, a couple of others. He became president of the Trade Association of Acceptance Dealers, and he boasted before, as president in his presidential address to the acceptance dealers, that he was the one who induced Benjamin Strong to establish this policy of subsidizing all-out permanent subsidy, acceptance price support, so to speak, foreign price support in the acceptance market. After 1929, the whole acceptance thing disappears. They don't try to do this anymore, but the damage was done in that sense. Well, Strong had a theoretician. In addition to having Morgan as his practical guide, he had a theoretical arm in Irving Fisher. And the idea of the so-called Stable Money League or Stable Money Association, which in various forms Fisher has been pushing since approximately 1911. Again, the idea was that Fisher, that if you since the business cycle is simply a dance of the dollar, all you have to do is for the government to stabilize the price level, pump money in when the prices are falling, take money out when the prices are rising, have a stable price level. This will end all problems, business cycle problems. This was called stable money, and the guys who were against inflation were called the sound money people. This is sound versus stable. The Austrian view, and also the Willis-Anderson view, was that this is going to mask a bad situation which is occurring, because first of all, in the free market, as I mentioned before, when productivity increases, prices are supposed to be falling, price level is supposed to be going down. And if you deliberately inflate bank credit, even if to stop prices from going down, even if the price level is stable, which it was basically in the 1920s, the wholesale price level was stable. But still in all, what's going on here is this whole process of overinflating in the capital goods industry, the expense of the consumer goods industries is still occurring. Even though prices don't go up, prices are higher than they would have been without this inflationary credit expansion. So Mises in Austria and Willis and Anderson in the United States and Robbins in England, etc., were constantly saying, "You gotta have a depression, you gotta watch out. This thing is going to collapse." And Fisher kept saying, "No, wholesale prices are constant. There's no problem." One thing about these price stabilizationists, when push comes to shove, they're always in favor of stabilizing. They're usually only in favor of stabilizing when there's a danger of prices falling. When prices are rising, you don't hear from them. They're out of town. they lose their enthusiasm for stable money. So really, price stabilization is another subtle form of price increase. Well, Fisher, as I say, begins. He is. If the capital market is overexpanded, this means that the stock market, something's happening in stocks and land and so forth. Overinflated, usually. Irving Fisher was heavily invested in the stock market himself, using his wife Carolyn, his wife's sisters, Carolyn Hazard's millions, and had plunged in a big way here in the stock market. And he kept urging more credit expansion and higher stock prices. During the boom of the 20s, he kept saying, "No, there's no problem. Price level is constant. Pump more money in the stock market." And during the recession, of course, he went ape. I mean, he was calling for reflation instead of saying, "Okay." It's funny. The price stabilization people, they could have said, when prices fell sharply from 29 to 33, they could have said, "Let's stabilize at the current level. I mean, the government should prevent prices from falling any further." They didn't say that. It became what was called then reflationists. It called for pushing the price level back up to 1929 and then stabilizing it to the 29 level, which doesn't make any sense really even within the Fisher category of stabilizing the price level. Because you're in favor of a stable price level, you're really saying you don't really care where the price level is. Just stabilize it wherever it is. And they say that during the 20s when the price level was stable, but bingo, you suddenly get to 1929-33 period, the prices have fallen a lot, they're calling for pushing it. Don't stabilize now, push the prices up back to 29 and then stabilize. Which shows they're really blankety-blank inflationists rather than under the mask of stabilization. Okay, so you couldn't imagine the number of big shots who were in the stable money movement. Now, it's true, many of them could have just signed their name. Fisher might have been a pest, I really don't know. And all these guys said, all right, I'll sign this. It sounds theoretical enough not to be dangerous. So I'll concede that. But still, I think there's something involved here. The fact that so many corporate liberal big shots were involved in this price stabilization movement. Who were some of these people? Well, for example, there was J.M. Keynes, who was cheering it from England, who was involved in this from the very beginning of this whole thing. There was our old and good friend John R. Cummins, who was very big in the stable price level movement. President William Howard Taft was extremely enthusiastic about it. Also, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, another brilliant monetary theorist. And Governor Woodrow Wilson, when he was governor and later president. All these guys signed up as part of the Stable Money League, or Stable Money Association, I forget what he called it then. There were several names to this. Also involved is Gifford Pinchot, the famous progressive conservationist. Assistant Secretary of State Huntington Wilson. Secretary of War Newton D. Baker under the Wilson administration. Professor James Harvey Rogers of Cornell was very, very big in the stabilization movement. Wesley C. Mitchell of the National Bureau of Economic Research, who was big in World War I planning. John E. Rovinsky of the Bank of America. Jeremiah W. Jenks, whom I already mentioned, as the economist for the National Civic Federation. Henry A. Wallace, heavily involved in this. Also, John C. Wynant, who was a beloved figure, apparently, in this. There's several pages in E. Digby Baltzell's great book, The Protestant Establishment, which deals with which deals with the greatness of John C. the belovedness of John C. Wynant throughout this whole corporate. Right. Also George Eastman of Eastman Kodak, I've already said, was heavily involved in progressive reform in Rochester. Samuel Gompers, naturally. John W. Davis, a Morgan lawyer, was ran for a Democratic nomination for president in 1924. Charles Dawes was vice president in the Republican administration. William Green of the American Federation of Labor. Otto Kahn, investment banker. Elihu Root. James H. Rand Jr. Remington Rand. Frederick C. Delano, who was faculty Roosevelt's uncle. Westbrook Pegler always used to refer to as Uncle Delano. Paul M. Warburg. Owen D. Young of General Electric. And the presidents, and also Norman Thomas, the final The final line, yappe. Incidentally, several people here have complained that they don't know what is this von yappe thing. And von yappe is an Italian word. L-A-G-N-I-A-P-P-E, which essentially means the icing on the cake, the final cherry on the birthday cake or something. Or adding insult to injury, the insult that's added to injury or whatever. There's a final line yappe in this whole thing. Norman Thomas was also involved in this with all the other, those other spiritual colleagues that I mentioned up somewhere. And Max Lazare of Lazare Frère in France, and Louis Rothschild, the great Rothschild banking family in Europe, also were involved in this. And the presidents of all the following associations for members of the Stable Money League and Stable Money Association: the American Association of Labor Legislation, which I mentioned already, the American Bar Association, the American Farm Bureau Federation, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, 43 chairman of 43 state bankers associations, the National Assembly of Credit Men, the National Education Association. This brings in our progressive educationists in the picture. The United Mine Workers, the National Grange, the Merchants Association of New York, and the Chicago Association of Commerce. Hoover's big theoreticians in the late 20s was the famous inflationary economic writing team of Forster and Catchings. Forster and Catchings wrote various inflationist works in the 20s in favor of public works to stabilize recessions, etc. This team is rather interesting. Forster was a theoretician. He's the guy who had this, who put out all this stuff about the giving X amount of dollars to each guy, etc. And Catchings, they formed the Pollock Foundation for Economic Research, I think it's called. And Waddell Catchings was more interesting than Forster in a sense. He was a partner of Goldman & Sachs investment banking company. He's also a iron and steel magnate who got heavily involved in inflationary theory. And then the two of them formed this alliance. Okay, just as a statistic here, the total money supply from June 30th, 1921 to June 30th, 29, during these 8 inflationary years, increased by approximately 62% over this 8-year period, including defining money in a very broad sense of anything, either bank deposits or demand deposits or anything redeemable at par in bank deposits, which is an average annual increase of something less than 8%. During, as I say, the first half of 1929, the money supply stops increasing and the whole thing collapses. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm rearranging things a bit. I'm going to press on with a monetary picture, at least during the early New Deal. I think I'm going to drop Hoover, because I think you all know what I have to say about Hoover since it's in the readings. Okay, I have a thing here, which is written. First, I began, this is a paper I delivered other places, not yet published. And I begin by sort of summing up the 20s as a background, things I've been saying, and then press on to the 30s. I'll start reading this and see what happens. The international monetary framework of the 1920s collapsed in the storm of the Great Depression, or rather a collapse of its own inner contradictions in a depression which it had helped to bring about. For one of the most calamitous features of the Depression was the international wave of banking failures, and the banks failed from the inflation and overexpansion which were the fruits of the managed international gold exchange standard. Once the jerry-built pyramiding of bank credit had collapsed, it brought down the banking system of nation after nation. As inflation led to a piling up of currency claims abroad, the cashing in of the claims led to well-founded suspicion of the solvency of other banks, and so the failures spread and intensified. The failures in the weak currency countries led to the accumulation of strains in other weak currency nations, and ultimately on the bases of the shaky pyramid, Britain and the United States. The major banking crisis began with the near bankruptcy in 1929 of the Bodenkredit-Anstalt of Vienna, the major bank, and in Austria, which had never recovered from its dismemberment at Versailles. Desperate attempts by J.P. Morgan, the House of Rothschild, and later the New York Fed to shore up the bank only succeeded in a temporary rescue, which committed more financial resources to an unsound bank and thereby made its ultimate failure in May 1931 all the more catastrophic. Rather than permit the outright liquidation of their banking systems, Austria, followed by Germany and other European countries, went off the gold standard during 1931. In 1933, we had a glorious opportunity to wipe out the entire banking system. I mean, it was being wiped out. Those of us who were, in contrast to Forrest, who were ardent Jacksonian types, saw the great vision, or would have seen if I were around in 1933, and if I were an economist then, would have seen this fantastic opportunity. I mean, the entire banking system was toppling. We could have gone over to very sound, non-fractional reserve money very easily then. At any rate, so faced with this choice, they all opt out and they go off the gold standard. But the key to the international monetary situation was Great Britain, the nub and the base for the world's gold exchange standard. British inflation and cheap money, and the standard which had made Britain the base of the world's money, put enormous pressure on the pound sterling as foreign holders of sterling balances became increasingly panicky and called on the British to redeem their sterling in either gold or dollars. And the French, what happened was the French specifically, I think, the French decided we've had it and started cashing in their sterling. The heavy loans by British banks to Germany during the 1920s made the pressure after the German monetary collapse still more severe. But Britain could have saved the day by using the classical gold standard medicine in such crisis, by raising bank interest rates sharply, thereby attracting funds to Britain from other countries. In such monetary crises, furthermore, such temporary tight money and checks to inflation gives foreigners confidence that the pound will be sustained, and they then continue to hold sterling without calling on the country for redemption. In earlier crises, for example, Britain had raised its bank rate, the bank rate meaning the Bank of England's rediscount rate, basically, to the other banks, had raised its bank rate as high as 10% early in the proceedings, and temporarily contracted the money supply to put a stringent check to inflation. But by 1931, deflation and hard money had become unthinkable in the British political climate. And so Britain stunned the financial world by keeping its bank rate very low, never raising it above 4.5%, and in fact continued to inflate sterling still further to offset gold losses abroad. As the run on sterling inevitably intensified, Great Britain cynically repudiated its own gold exchange standard, the very monetary standard that it had forced and cajoled Europe to adopt, by coolly going off the gold standard on September 1931, saying, well, tough fellas, we ain't playing this game anymore. We're not going to redeem it in gold or dollars. Its own international monetary system was sacrificed on the altar of continued domestic inflation. Benjamin Anderson, in his book, Economics and Public Welfare, gives a little poignant little story of the head of the Dutch Central Bank, I forget his name, who calls up the Montague Norman about a day before, the British Treasury, I forget which, about a day before Britain goes off the gold standard. It's very secret, of course. You don't go off the gold standard except in deepest secrecy. He calls up and says, look, fellas, you owe me a lot of money and so forth. I've been a great friend of yours, and please tell me if you intend to go off the gold standard, because then I'll pull out. Give me this one little break. And he said, don't worry, we'll never go off the gold standard, never. We're your old friend, we can assure you of this, and the next day, they go off the gold standard. This is typical. I mean, as bad as governments are in general, they're worse and they're scurviest on the international monetary devaluation, etc. front. They lie constantly. They double deal, etc. on a grand scale. It's all done for the public interest. Don't worry, folks. The European monetary system was thereby broken up into separate and even warring currency blocks. And one of the things that Karen was asking yesterday about the Friedmanite freely fluctuating exchange rate system. And one of the problems, I don't want to go into the economic theoretical critique of this, but one of the practical political problems of this thing is that it'll never happen in a million years. You'll never have a situation where every government is given total power over its fiat currency, over its own banks and its own currency, and then stay back and permit their currency, their precious currency to fluctuate freely. It'll never happen. So what you have is, if this starts happening, you'll very quickly have currency blocks, exchange controls, bilateral deals, and all the monstrous stuff that we had in the 30s, which is the consequence of everybody going off the gold standard. We have competing devaluations where you devalue your currency a little bit, so get your export, you subsidize your exports, and the other guy does the other thing, and then you have you have exchange controls, and a fantastic mess develops. The European monetary system is thereby broken up into separate and even warring currency blocks, replete with fluctuating exchange rates, exchange control, and trade restrictions. The major countries follow Britain off the gold standard, with the exception of Belgium, Holland, France, Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. Currency blocks form with the British Empire, forming a sterling block, with parities mutually fixed in relation to the pound. So they're floating, but they're fixed in relation to each other, something like the common market is doing now. It's particularly ironic that one of the earliest effects of Britain's going off gold was that the overvalued pound, which Britain had insisted, and had put everybody else through the ringer to keep at 486. Now, when they got off the gold standard, now the pound was free to fluctuate. The pound shot right down to its genuine economic value at approximately $3.40 for the pound. So after all this headache they imposed on the world, when they allow the pound to float, it goes right down. And so Britain's grand experiment of returning to a form of gold at an overvalued par had ended in disaster for herself as well as for the rest of the world. In the last weeks of the Hoover administration, a desperate attempt was made by the United States to restore an international monetary system. This time the offer was made to Britain to return to the gold standard at the current eminently more sensible par, means 380, 350, 340, in exchange for substantial reduction of the British war debt. No longer would Britain be forced by overvaluation to be in a chronic state of depression of its export industry. See, by this time the British had realized they did something wrong back there, and it's better to have the British pound low and stimulate their exports. This is what the Marxists call education through struggle. Learning through the struggle. No longer would Britain be forced by overvaluation to be in a chronic state of depression of its export industries. But Britain now has the nationalist bit in its teeth, and it insisted on outright reflation of prices back to the pre-depression 1929 levels. Now we have this reflation bit. It had become increasingly clear that the powerful price stabilizationists, the Fisher, Cummins, etc. group, were interested not so much in stabilization as in high prices, and now they would only be satisfied with an inflationary return to the 1929 levels. Britain's rejection of the American offer proved to be fatal for any hopes of international monetary stability. The world's monetary fate finally rested with the United States, the major gold country, standard country still remaining. Federal Reserve attempts to inflate the money supply and to lower interest rates during the Depression further weakened confidence in the dollar, and gold outflows combined with runs and failures of the banks to put increasing pressure on the American banking system. See, Hoover tried desperately to inflate. Milton Friedman, in his book, Monetary History of the United States, denounces Hoover for lowering the money supply and from 1929 to 33, and thereby precipitating a depression, supposedly. Actually, Hoover is trying his damnedest to increase the money supply. He's trying everything possible. The Federal Reserve was buying securities like mad. They were pushing down interest rates. The problem was that the depression had set in, and the confidence was weakened, and the public was cashing in their money. They're cashing in their bank accounts, or getting hard cash and even gold, and redemption was being demanded from abroad, etc. So all this overweighed the desperate attempts by Hoover to inflate. Finally, during the interregnum between the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, the nation's banks began to collapse in earnest. The general bank collapse meant that the banking system, always unsound and incapable of paying more than a fraction of its liabilities on demand, could only go in either of two opposite directions. Talking about this big opportunity work then. A truly laissez-faire policy would have allowed the failing banks to collapse and thereby to engage in a swift, sharp, surgical operation. It would have transformed the nation's monetary system from an unsound, inflationary one to a truly hard and stable currency. The other pole was for the government to declare massive bank holidays, i.e. to relieve the banks of the obligation to pay off their debts, which they had done, of course, in every previous depression every previous financial crisis from 1814 on, and then move on to the repudiation of the gold standard and its replacement by inflated fiat paper issued by the government. It is important to realize that neither the Hoover nor the Roosevelt administrations had any intention of taking the first route, the sharp surgical operation back to hard money route. While there was a considerable split on whether or not to stay on the gold standard, no one endorsed the rigorous laissez-faire route. One thing is that even though Hoover, of course, was still in favor of keeping on the gold standard, his Secretary of Treasury, Ogden Mills, and his Undersecretary, Arthur Ballantyne, by the time March 33 came around, they were in favor of going off the gold standard. They were anticipating the Roosevelt policy. The new Roosevelt administration was now faced with a choice of retaining or going off the gold standard. While almost everyone supported the temporary bank holidays, even Anderson and Willis, these people said, well, we have to save the banks. That's it's a key thing. Might have been helped along by their Chase Bank connections. While almost everyone supported temporary bank holidays, there was a severe split on the longer-run question of the monetary standard. While the bulk of the nation's academic economists stood staunchly behind the gold standard, it's hard to imagine now, but they did. It was, I think 5,000 economists or 1,200 or something wrote a big letter, a big public statement endorsing sticking in the gold standard. The indefatigable Irving Fisher redoubled his agitation for inflation, spurred onward by his personal desire to reinflate stock prices. Since the Stable Money Association had been supposedly dedicated to price stabilization, that was Fisher's group, and what Fisher and the inflationists wanted now was a drastic raising of prices, the association liquidated its assets and changed its name. So it disappeared, got a new name. In other words, instead of the Stable Money Association, which since 1911 had been calling for stabilizing prices, now they dropped the name, and they form a new name called the Committee for the Nation to Rebuild Prices and Purchasing Power.